It's interesting. I was at a church recently listening to a sermon, and first of all, I'm looking around going, I hope I'm not being complicit to be in this space, but I was trying to be supportive of a friend. And the first point of the sermon was an us against them. Like
Yeah,
all those people out there are bad. And so
yeah,
it's a real fear-based place you're coming from, and you're like, oh my gosh, they're bad. They're bad. And that's all you latch onto
yeah,
until you actually use your brain and think about it. How are they bad? What are they doing that's bad?
yeah,
And then you get to the last point of the sermon and it's you're bad too.
yeah,
And so you have this like massive hyper vigilance going on
yeah.
around you, the world, yourself. How am I showing up? Is it okay to be here?
Mm.
Like, what am I doing that's displeasing to God? Do I need to repent again? And it's just this massive hypervigilance in your body. And so
Yeah.
when somebody suggests something like vaccinations are bad and all the research behind them is a conspiracy, you latch onto it really easily.
Yes. Anyway, this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer. And today my guest is Michelle Moffitt. And Michelle is a friend of mine, Melanie Brooks, who wrote a book called A Hard Silence. And Melanie is a good pal and has been doing some editing on something I've been working on for the last 5 years. And so we have a nice connection here, Michelle, through her. Let me just introduce you properly. Michelle is a psychotherapist, leadership coach, Enneagram expert, and author of Cracked Open, A Journey to a Resilient and Independent Mindset. And Michelle was referred to us, as I just said, by Melanie Brooks. In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer is what you're watching and or listening to. And I'm going to ask you to please subscribe right now on YouTube and to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, if that's the way you're getting our wise and wonderful show. And my Substack, it has to be said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And so now we are live on YouTube, and then later this is turned into a podcast and goes to where podcasts go. And we're talking today with someone who has written a book that we've just mentioned. Um, and I finished reading this morning on Kindle. So all my notes that I've taken are on my note page here, which I will be referring to. And what I typically do is not go in order, but in a way introduce the book through the themes that I'm going to be talking about. Now, you have some stories in this book that I won't be telling because there's no point me retelling your stories. I tend more to drill down on the substance of what I think it all means. And the only thing I want to say first before we get into it is that we share something of our background in that I grew up in an evangelical fundamentalist community. I left that, fled, as I put it. Um, there, our stories are very different because your story is about a relationship that went very bad in a marriage that you were, brought into through the kind of teaching that I was brought up on. But in terms of the conclusions you draw, though our stories are different, um, there's a lot that I like very much, and I'm going to be talking about that. And so the first thing I would just tell people is that Michelle has written a good book. Um,
Thank you.
and you have a copy there. So I'm going to ask you to hold it up and show people. Can you read the title and the subtitle?
Sure. Cracked Open, A Journey to a Resilient and Independent Mindset.
So before we get into the book, what do you do now? This book came out when?
In January.
Yeah, so it's new. And what do you do day to day now? And I'll describe what I do day to day now. I'm working on a new book. I'm cooking tonight for my grandson, who's got a friend from France visiting in a school exchange program. So basically, I'm a cook and bottle washer and child caregiver who also writes. I have a long, interesting history, an evangelical world, and my father being a famous theologian and so forth. But kind of where I live day to day isn't all about that. It's more about what I do that I'm most interested in, which is the kind of quality of the relationships that I have with my grandchildren, three of whom live across the street, and the ordinary things of life. And so you do counseling
Mhm.
and you do other things, but just give me a thumbnail of who you are before we get into the book. I mean, not the part the book covers, but just,
Right. Yeah, sure. Day to day, I wake up and kind of think through. I feel like I've started three businesses. So I have a counseling practice that I've had to rebrand because my counseling practice was clinically trained and biblically informed.
Yeah.
And so I've had to rebrand that to move out of kind of biblical counseling. Um, and I have my book I'm promoting, and I also am a leadership coach. I do workshops and speak to larger groups and mostly executives.
Yeah. So cutting to the chase, one writer to another, can you earn your livelihood doing all this stuff? Or are you, how do you manage?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, that is actually the question that I wake up with every morning. Like,
Yes,
where
me
am I getting
too.
paid?
Self-unemployed.
Yes, where am I getting paid? What needs to be my main focus?
Yeah.
Can I add a little bit of fun to that
Yeah.
while I'm doing it? And what do I need to do to make sure I'm taking care of myself? Because I feel like self-care is a part-time job.
Sure. But
So
how do you put all that together? Because we're going to get into the story in the book, and people will understand when we talk about that, why I'm asking you basically, well, how are you now?
yeah,
And what are
yeah,
you doing? And how are you making ends meet? Because you've come out of a marriage relationship that foundered and went away, and you've changed your point of view, as I have. And of course, in my past, those transitions, and I don't usually go here, by the way. I don't know why I'm starting here with you. But those transitions cost me a fortune,
mm,
literally, because the God money in the God business that I was in was huge, and we had access to massive followings. My dad was a kind of a cult guru of a big group, and all I had to do is basically take the family name and cash in on it. Walking away from that with a wife and three children in my late 20s and early 30s was life changing, not just because of the philosophical religious considerations, but the real everyday shit. Like, now what do we do?
right.
I don't know how to do anything else. I've spent the last 10 years as the sort of sidekick shill to my parents, making a movie series with him and Dr. Coop and other people who then went on and did stuff in the evangelical world. And so I'm always interested in a story like yours because we tend to sort of intellectualize it or talk about the theology as if it's all ideas, but you live in the real world.
Mhm.
So I'm going to start very backward here and just drill down on this a little bit.
Yeah,
How have you put your
absolutely.
life together since you made these big changes? And part one, part two, what are the transitions you're still in? Because the book isn't the end of a journey, it's kind of the beginning of one. So let's get present tense for a minute and then we'll drill down on the book.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Frank, for understanding and seeing that. That's really important to me.
Hmm.
Um, the transition was terrifying and hard. It was noble to not make money in that
Mm-hmm.
space, and at the same time, the expectation for other people to provide for you was huge. I've read your memoir, so I'm like,
Yeah,
I feel like all the things happening in your book and the belief systems in that space. So, if somebody was wealthy, of course they could be doing more for the kingdom, and you would receive
sure.
scholarships. I was tired of being the scholarship family. Um, to the Christian camps or to the Christian schools or
Yeah,
whatever it was. But there was an expectation that people should do that for us
yeah.
since we were the leaders. As a woman, I wasn't allowed to lead. I wasn't allowed to vote in our denominational meetings.
Hmm.
Uh, I could get a helping degree of sorts. And so we wanted, we were finding people within the church community that had mental health issues. And that was that was being talked about finally. The stigma was being relieved a little bit around that. And so I went to seminary to get a master's in counseling in my 40s, fortunately, so that I had something to fall back on once
Hmm.
I left the system and my marriage. But all of my clients were within the church at that time.
Yeah,
And so for today, having to figure that out, what does that look like? I would go to pastors and say, "Hey, this is what I offer, and this is how I can see your parishioners the best way." And then I was full, right? Everybody was sending clients to me. When I left, I went to more progressive churches because that had been the habit, and that's how I found
sure.
clients, and I wasn't getting any clients. And so I asked some friends that are a little bit more progressive, and I said, "Would you ever ask your pastor or your priest for a counseling referral?" And
Hmm.
they said, "No, that's
Yeah,
weird. Why would I ask them? I would just find a good counselor."
yeah,
So, that stuff, that dissonance, that rewiring
yeah.
from living in kind of a bubble world where you hire a Christian plumber, you hire a Christian
Yeah,
this,
sure.
everything's
Christian yellow pages back in the days, there were such things.
there were such things. Yes.
So let me
Yeah.
start with something you do bring up in your book, and then I'm going to go to actual quotes and
Yeah.
read your book to you and ask you questions.
Okay.
Michelle is a psychotherapist. Let's just go with that. In that comes from a world, if I may say so, that doesn't like psychotherapy and basically sees all these things as spiritual problems that ought to be solved with prayer or counseling from your pastor, or if you had a closer walk with the Lord, this wouldn't be happening. So let's just take the big one first in terms of where you're at now. And that is you're in a profession that is not regarded as legitimate by the people that you come from. Rephrase that and explain it a little bit, and then just talk about how you made that jump before we talk about, your journey, just the fact that you're doing something which is outside of the realm of what many evangelicals even regard as legitimate.
Yeah. Yes, all of that. And I think the convincing of that we're whole selves, that we have mental illness is a real thing, but a lot of times in some evangelical circles, they don't believe in science. So even
Right.
the psychology of, science of psychology isn't a real thing.
Yeah.
And if you just trusted more or prayed more, you would be better. There were several times within our faith community that people needed to be on medication for
Yeah.
some pretty intense mental health issues, and that was frowned upon
Mhm.
to take medication that might level you out a little bit because something other must be going on, whether you have a demon or
Sure.
you're not reading the correct version of the Bible or you're
Yeah.
not in the ESV maybe. And so it was a place of educating churches, I think, in that space of like what is helpful to your parishioners. A lot of the pastors have one class in biblical pastoral counseling,
Mhm.
but feel that they have the ability to tell people what they need to be doing with their lives and their
Mhm.
mental health. So I think it's a difficult place, and it's a difficult place for people because they just get pigeonholed into ways of being, and it's not healthy for them.
Mhm.
I think
Yeah, one thing I noticed in reading your book is that strain runs through it of the view of psychology and all this that the evangelical community has. But then, of course, it's kind of also a training ground for the kind of conspiratorial rejection of medicine anyway. So
yeah,
it doesn't surprise me at all that the anti-vax movement finds a deep-seated support system within so many of these groups, because basically the suspicion of science and the world and worldly knowledge is inculcated into you at a very young age in evangelicalism, where you see yourself as apart from the world, capitalized there, all those people out there. So all anybody like a Donald Trump or a Kennedy or any of these other people have to hook into is that general level of paranoia and the persecution complex that already sees anything that comes from the outside as suspect and probably malign. So just talk about that a little bit, and then we're going to get into the book.
yeah. It's interesting. I was at a church recently listening to a sermon, and I was, first of all, I'm looking around going, I hope I'm not being complicit to be in this space, but I was trying to be supportive of a friend. And the first point of the sermon was an us against them. Like
Yeah,
all those people out there are bad. And so
yeah,
it's a real fear-based place you're coming from, and you're like, oh my gosh, they're bad. They're bad. And that's all you latch onto
yeah,
until you actually use your brain and think about it. How are they bad? What are they doing that's bad?
yeah,
And then you get to the last point of the sermon and it's you're bad too.
yeah,
And so you have this like massive hyper vigilance going on
yeah.
around you, the world, yourself. How am I showing up? Is it okay to be here?
Mm.
Like, what am I doing that's displeasing to God? Do I need to repent again? And it's just this massive hypervigilance in your body. And so when
Yeah.
somebody suggests something like vaccinations are bad and all the research behind them is a conspiracy, you latch onto it really easily.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and it fits in with a certain worldview you've already developed as a protective measure to not have to question anything. You can just reject it as demonic or at least, outside the faith. So now we're going to jump into the book here. Cracked Open, A Journey to a resilient and independent mindset. Hold the book up again. I want people to see the cover. I'm asking Michelle to do this only because my copy is out in the hallway it's going to do me no good because all my notes are right here and I'm about to dive into them. So let me jump into your book. I'm just going to start with a quote I'm going to read here. And as I said, these are not taken in particular order. They're put together in a way that I want to do it. Writing this book became a complex journey. I think actually this comes out of your acknowledgments. I'm not sure. Writing journeyed beyond simply putting words on a page. My body relived the experiences I narrated. The process was far more profound and essential to navigate. I found myself surrounded by sticky notes and red string, like an investigator piecing together a crime. And I'm using my voice. I wrote this book out of necessity for my own understanding to make sense of what happened in my life. As I filled the pages with words, I isolated myself at home. When I did go out, I started checking my surroundings just like I used to. Fear gripped me. Am I safe? Are they watching and judging me? Is this okay to be in my life? Is it okay to be here? At Costco and buy perfect bars and fresh flowers. Even the most mundane normal activities caused me to jump. As I wrote, more words brought more emotions, and so on and so on. So basically, this is toward, I think, the end of the book in an acknowledgement section. But what it seemed to me to do when I read it was set up a story being told by someone who was so emotionally stressed by telling their own story that you could hardly bring yourself to tell it. And I was kind of joking before we started here that your book, basically everybody's referred to as, as I'll call so-and-so. You don't talk about the denomination. You don't talk about the name of the college you left, where you went back to. So let me go to the very basis of the beginning of your stress here. And if you want to just go to the big experiences that were so formative in terms of the way you were formed, not just how you were brought up, but what happened to you. Because I think in a way, talking with you about this book is like talking about a war story, but avoiding the scene where the person got shot and was in a care facility for 10 years learning to walk again. You can't just brush over it. So rather than quoting your own book to you, which I'm going to do some more of, I want you to give me a thumbnail sketch of the worst bits of your life that led you to be that traumatized while writing your own story. And take it in any order you want. But yeah. I'm not pushing you to do things that aren't in the book because you've told the story in the book, but I want to hear it from you here.
Sure. Yeah. I think the one of the biggest things that happened for me was reporting the abuse that I was having from my husband and asking for help, asking for a lifeline from the other church leaders and hearing back from them that we don't believe you. And, yeah. And that was a huge trauma because when I started moving away and moved, 3,000 miles away from where I was, I was like, does anybody believe me? Like, am I going to be able to survive if I'm not believed? Because I don't know where I stand, and becoming isolated, hiding, in not in my story, but also I was like, I don't want to be my story. I don't want to like make this be my identity.
Yes,
I was part of this trauma because I'm more than that, but also. They had threatened to take away my livelihood. They had threatened, like, how can you say you're a counselor and you don't have any leadership overseeing you from the church?
Yeah.
How can you? And so I was like, well, if they're going to take away my livelihood, I'm shot. Like, I got nothing.
Yeah.
Right? Those were some things. I think as a woman, it was really hard. I had some early traumas that happened during college. Somebody had slipped a roofie in my drink and in the 80s, and you didn't really talk about getting raped back then. And so, that part of like, I don't know what to do with that. I'm just going to have to be quiet. And I think the layers and layers and layers of like, I just have to be quiet. I just have to be quiet. I just have to be quiet.
Yeah.
I have to try to make this work. And I talk about this in my book. Divorce wasn't an option. We were actually asked to remove that from our vocabulary. So whatever happened, you needed to try to make it work. And Jesus was going to be enough to make anything work. And 2 weeks in, my husband, sits down and says, I've lied to you. And I was like, lied about what? I'm very forthcoming and what you see is what you get. And he said, I've lied about how fast I ran the 40, what grades I got, how much I weigh, that I was involved with other people during, our engagement and so on and so forth. And I just thought, I don't know what, this doesn't compute. I don't know what to do with this. And so again, I'm having to hide what was actually going on in my life. I'm not allowed to talk about this. And he said, please don't tell anybody. And in
Mm.
a complementarian system, the man is the head and I need to submit to him. And I
Yeah.
was zealous for God. I wanted to do what they were telling me was
Yeah.
appropriate to love this God.
Well, and you also talk about the fact that you kind of married someone you basically didn't know, and he
Right.
was a completely different person than the person you thought you had married. Talk a little bit about that. And also, you talk about his makeup in terms of this kind of narcissistic
Yeah.
behavior. So, talk about those two things. Talk about him for a moment so we get a picture of what you were stuck with, and then we'll kind of go from there.
Yeah, I think one of the first things that comes to my mind, well, first of all, I didn't plan on getting a PhD, an honorary PhD in narcissism when I got married.
Yeah.
Um, but I think, in these systems, you have the pastors and the pastors' wives might get together a lot. So I would get together with pastors' wives and to encourage, and
Mm.
we were leadership, and it's lonely at
Yeah.
the top, and trying to figure out how to support each other the best. And a lot of times the wives would talk about, um, well, we need to work on our marriage. We need to have a couple dates. We've become roommates again. And I would sit in those places going, I don't even know where to start. I don't know how
Yeah.
to share what is going on in my marriage. It's so confusing.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to do the best I can. And
Yeah, and you have one scene where you're sitting in the second row, the second pew from the front, trying to be, I think you used the word the shiny. Maybe it's shiny is the word, trying
yeah,
to look like you're glittery and shiny and happy so that you and your children, you and your family, you and your husband, whatever, will be judged by how you appear. So, you're also keeping up a physical front as well. It's not just what you say, it's how you have to look.
right. Yeah, and even in that, it's like the kids can't kick each other in the
Yeah.
pews, and there's a way we have to show up. And I can't talk poorly about my husband because the word of God might not be received as well to the
Mm.
people listening if they know that he's human or he's done things wrong. But yeah, I think with the narcissism piece, it's so confusing. I would say he was more of a covert narcissist, if people
Mm.
want to check that out. But it's kind of this benevolence, you're good, but yourself is so fractured and shameful that,
Yeah.
but it leads to so much gaslighting and so much deflection. And there would be times where I would take my kids to their athletic events, and he would approach me later and say I was neglecting him. And neglect is kind of a word you use for children.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
in one point later in your book, you talk, you don't sort of offer solutions in the sense of a how to, but you say something. There's a very good paragraph here I want to read that sort of takes you to some of the things you learned as you journeyed out of all this. Learning to uphold my boundary meant using the following phrases. I'm not comfortable with this. Please don't do that. Not this time. I can't do that for you. This doesn't work for me. I've decided not to. This is not acceptable. I'm drawing a line at. I don't want to do that. I tell myself, Michelle, I honor your needs, preferences, and limitations. And I remind myself, and this is a really good one here, no is a complete sentence. So just talk about the process of going from where you were to being able to write that paragraph, because obviously that's a different person than the younger woman who's raped, who leaves the college where a bad thing happened to her, goes somewhere else, which, by the way, neither institution gets named in the book. So maybe we'll go there. But there's a kind of there's a timidity in your book to expose some of the people who did it wrong to you because you're sort of telling your story. But then on the other hand, the very fact you have to come up with that list of sentences like, no, I don't want to do that. I don't feel like that sort of shows how you've changed, but also how you view your relationship with people and in terms of the abuse you suffered.
mhm.
And I think by cutting to the end there, there's a kind of it sheds light on the path you've traveled. I just wondered if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, the schools I was at, University of Washington and University of Southern
Okay.
California.
Yeah.
So we'll throw that out there. And again, writing the book was a really difficult, hard experience and terrifying,
Hmm.
to say the least. Just a fear of the fear that these people had put into me. Um,
Yeah.
and that's not at all how I grew up. And so it was really a coming back to myself of who I was and what I believed in. Um, I think it was interesting until even a few years ago, I didn't understand that the word patriarchy was more of a cultural term. I just
Mm.
referred to it as something about Abraham.
Yeah.
And and so understanding that, I feel like I was in this sort of triple patriarchy when I
Mm.
began to understand my marriage was very patriarchal, the church was very patriarchal, and
Yeah.
our greater culture is. And so I was absorbed. My husband would use the words leave, cleave, and weave,
Mm.
that I was overtaken by him, that I was needing to wipe his ass all the time, and my own needs and wants were let go of. And that was supposed to be in the greater church. That was the way women were supposed to show up.
Yeah.
We were unpaid labor for the church. And so I think I started going to see an addiction specialist that dealt with codependence, and she gave me these words. And I
Mm.
think there, a lot of them for the listeners are on the Al-Anon website,
Sure.
if you want to find some of those. And it was incredibly hard to start saying those things because it was a whole shift in my body, down to my cells. My cells had believed so intensely in the way that I was operating,
Yeah.
and having to stand up for myself was really, really difficult. I remember the one of the things that I said was, he would come after me with these things that you would feel like you got caught in his system, and you didn't have a way out to say something. And so he would say, "You don't love me anymore." And I'm like, I don't know what to do with that.
Yeah.
I'm supposed to say, "Of course I love you," blah blah blah. And I was like, took a big deep breath, because my counselor had taught me to say, "I'm not getting in that loop with you."
Yeah.
And those kinds of steps forward really helped me to establish boundaries. And so I would say, I'm going to do my laundry and the children's laundry.
Mhm.
I wouldn't say, I'm not doing your laundry. I would just, you can figure out how your laundry's
Yeah.
going to,
Yeah.
just being able to even have boundaries around my space in the house. Like, I
Mm.
need to be able to be in a space without you hovering, or stalking, basically, is what it was. But
Yeah. So what just to um, get to a point in the story, kind of which changed how you were seeing your marriage there, the moment, should we say, before you went into that group where they rejected you and said they didn't believe you and sided with your husband, what led up to that moment specifically that you said, okay, now I'm gonna, do something different. There must have been some moments of decision there. What did they key off of?
yeah, that specific moment that's in the intro is, it had been brewing for a while. Should we say,
Yeah.
my husband had had several personal leaves of absences without the church knowing what the cause was, or what he
Mm.
was doing, and it was really to get stabilized because he was not well. Um, and I'm left with my kids at home in February in Boston, and it's snowing, and I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to get these sidewalks cleaned off, plus get the kids to school,
Yeah.
and things were just really falling apart. And I think at some point I was starting to leak some information that was going on at home, and that I
Mm.
really needed some help. And so I would timidly push articles across to the elders or some other pastors saying, "Hey, I think Bessel van der Kolk's book would be important for you to read right now. I
Mm.
think this book by Leslie Vernick on the emotionally destructive marriage would be really important for you to read right now. Could you read that?"
Mm.
And so I started pushing the information out because I needed help. And so I really thought that I was going to get help. In that role, again, leadership's lonely at the top. You don't know who
Yeah.
to talk to. You don't know where your lifelines are. And I really thought, this is my last ditch effort. I also felt like my husband was going to lose his job if I reported what was going on
Mm.
with his mental health, which he probably should have lost his job with so
Yeah.
many other things happening. But if I was the cause of him losing his job, I didn't want that on me. He needed to
Yeah.
be able to report what was going on with him. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I just reintroduce you here. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I ask people to subscribe on YouTube and to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And to my Substack, it has to be said at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And today I am talking with Michelle Moffitt, and Michelle is a psychotherapist and leadership coach. And she's also the author of a book that we're delving into here called Cracked Open, A Journey to a Resilient and Independent Mindset. And there's the book. Thank you for holding it up, because my copy's on the shelf back there, and I read on Kindle. And so I'm getting to the notes again here because I want to talk a little bit about your own childhood and the family you grew up in, because you write, I think on page 70 or so, 9 years deep into a complementarian system, granting the man the final word, I was obligated to submit to his leadership and authority and become a pastor's wife. I felt tied to this belief system and absorbed the scripture used to defend it. After all, I wanted to do what seemed right in God's eyes. So that obviously ties back into more than just that moment. How would you say your own childhood, the way you were raised in the belief system that you came to adulthood with, prepared you to think in those terms to begin with? Just describe that background a little bit.
My childhood was actually really lovely, and
Yeah,
parents were very supportive. We went to a very progressive church where we would do transcendental meditations on our youth
yeah,
retreats. And I grew up in Seattle. It was very progressive in the day and very
yeah.
multicultural. And so the church background, or the church I found myself and the doctrines I found myself in, were not at all what I was raised with.
Yeah, so talk about that process, because the way you were raised was so different than the way I was raised. We have a similar journey, but a different start, because I
Yeah.
was in the movement from the very beginning.
Yeah. And
You were not. So I just
I
want
was
to
not.
talk about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. My dad was a big feminist, and my parents would be like, why be the flight attendant when you could be the pilot? And I really wanted to be the flight attendant because I liked the outfits they got to wear in the 70s. But I thought, sense of adventure and all that. Why be the nurse when you could be the doctor? So very much my parents were like, you can do whatever you want
Yeah,
as a woman. And I alluded to those traumas that happened during college. I transferred back and forth several times during my college stint. And I think my body and my brain were trying to tell me how to find belonging. And as 18-year-olds, we don't know where we belong. And we're,
well, you talk about wanting to belong, and that group was so inviting because you had this desire to be part of the group. But I'm just wondering what that transition was, because did you talk to your parents about some of the trauma that you had in college, or were you keeping that all silent?
I had one trauma my freshman year where one of our roommates overdosed, and she lived, thankfully, but I told my parents, and they said, you need to come home. So I ended up coming from USC back to University of Washington
Right.
uh, against my will and my desires, and so having to restart again at a new college and find friends and all of that. And then the second week at the University of Washington, I was slipped a roofie in a drink and date raped. And so that whole year, I mean, Seattle's kind of gray as it is, but that whole year was incredibly grayscale
Mm.
for me. And then I put together whatever you would call a PowerPoint back in the day. Maybe it was where you dropped the pieces of paper to say, here's why I need to go back to USC, mom and dad. And so they let me go back to USC, um, and my body and my brain, because we're holistic, we
Mm.
was looking for safety. And I was just like, if somebody could just show me how to show up in the world and keep me safe, I will do whatever you tell me. And I have a tendency to be overly optimistic and Pollyanna-ish. And so that landed me in this system where somebody said, hey, if you say this prayer, we got you. You're
Yeah.
sealed. You're with us. And who doesn't want to be a part of a group who has fun activities for you all the time, and who, in the church community, brings you meals when you have babies and sets up play dates for you. And so all of a sudden I'm finding myself at USC with this group that is saying, you belong to us and we'll take you, we accept you, and here's all the events you get to participate in and belong, and you're not going to be by yourself ever. So that was my entry into that system.
When in the book you talk about starting to binge watch programs on narcissism and so forth, but that was kind of your attempt to understand your husband a little more. As that unfolded, um, were you able to share any of that with him or with the people in the church, or was this completely private and you're just doing all this by yourself?
I was sharing with some people in the church. I had a broader community, a Christian community in Boston,
Yeah.
um, and some, but I just wasn't sure who I could trust and who would believe me and who would help me, because you're supposed to work through anything. And my husband wasn't admitting to the abuse that he had done. And I was like, how am I supposed to work with this?
How are you supposed to work with that? Yeah. And then, at what time did you start talking, if I can put it this way? I don't want to imply you were dishonest, but at what point did you talk to someone honestly and openly about the range of the things you had faced in terms of this journey? Because
Mhm.
you talk about at one point in your book, I think like page 97, you say, I believe it is essential to have male allies, men who are willing to step into the hard conversations and promote change, not just lip service, and men who do their hard work by examining their own backstory and bias to challenge the cultural norms in order to promote women, all the while sacrificing their reputation and opportunities as they see the future benefit.
Yeah.
As BD says, if love truly is able to triumph, is it not worth the risk of potentially losing your position of power to see what else might be out there? And the reason I mention that in this context, aside from the quote itself and the value of it, is just, to find people like that, you have to at some point have an honest conversation with somebody. The man who's going to be honest about you or with you
Mhm.
has got to hear from you, not just your backstory, but something concrete to react to. So what brought you to that place of looking for male allies
Mhm.
in having come from an environment that you converted to in which you couldn't be honest with people? You're facing a room full of people who say, we don't believe you.
I had reached out to some family members. So I had some cousins, my sister and brother-in-law, my father, and then a couple people outside of the system, fortunately, because a lot of times these systems keep you insulated. And so I had them, I would meet with these church leaders and they would tell me, you need to obey us. And I was like, oh, because you took vows to us. And I was like, I did take vows. What do I do with that? Like, and then my people outside would be like, you took vows to a toxic system. And I was like, oh, okay, right. Okay. And they said they're gonna kick me out. They're gonna excommunicate me. And they're like, okay, you're getting excommunicated from a toxic system. You don't want to be a part of that. And it felt like so much of my character was, being hung up and left out to dry. That was the harder part, but it was really, this indoctrination. And I know in some part of your book, you wrote something about the being, trusting your intuition or your gut. And I would say I felt gut washed. I learned to not trust my intuition. There was also a pastor and his wife that were kind of assigned to us to kind of talk through some of these things that were happening. And I later found out there's so many sideways conversations that happened and agendas that were going on. But I later found out when I asked them about this, did you report what was going on to the greater session or the greater ruling body? And he hadn't. And so I was like, okay, but you are not an ally. What were you trying to do and what were you protecting in that space?
I'm referring to Baptist Land by Krista Brown. She wrote a whole book on the kind of cover up in the Southern Baptist Convention
Mhm.
of reports of abuse and people blaming the women and so forth and so on. I want to just introduce you again here so we stick with the program. Michelle Moffitt is a psychotherapist, and she's written this book, Cracked Open: A Journey to Resilient and Independent Mindset. I want to change the subject here and sort of broaden out a little bit and get your view on something as someone who's done this. One of the people we interviewed a little while ago was Magdalene J. Taylor, who writes a lot about relationships and so forth. And I think just to contextualize your journey, I think some of us who come out of a more evangelical background, I know you converted to it, and that's not your deep background, but you went through this. Basically, start seeing things through that lens. Like I see it through the lens of having been Francis Nita Schaeffer's son, and I came out of the evangelical background. You talk in your book about the sort of the preoccupation with virginity and marriage and all the rest of this. And you marry young, you don't burn with lust, all these things that, I experienced in my own group. But there's a kind of a wider context that's very 20th and 21st century that both of us have lived our lives in when it comes to relationships and women. And Magdalene writes a lot about this. And essentially she says in an article called Main Character Energy, which I just got on her Substack site today, she prefaces it by saying our romantic lives are often guided by digitally imposed needs to be the main character, to live, quote, for the plot. What if the story isn't our own? And then she goes on and talks about people who engage in behaviors against their best interest are timeless. Among women in movies, they are female, they are femme fatale, are manic pixie dream girls, whatever other flat label we wish to use. Unlike the usual narrative arc of these labels in film, however, these contemporary real world women aren't side characters. They aren't here to serve some more compelling story of the men in question. No, the women are the protagonists. They're all in pursuit of, quote, main character energy. And any main character, in order to be our protagonist, must go through some major tribulation, some conflict, both internal and external, that yields a change. And then after going through this whole thing and talking about a lot of her contemporaries in New York City, young women who are out there doing interesting, hot kind of things, she finishes and asks them all this question. And it's an interesting one. She says, you are the main character of your own life. So is everyone else. The question is, who exactly is in the director's chair? Is it you? And it was interesting because I just read your book when I read her column, and I really like her work. And she sort of is very much in that mix of younger women trying to find their way. So I would just say two things. That group of women and the relationships they seek with a certain group of men, strike me as people who are really floundering a lot of the time. We have not, however relationships are supposed to work, there's nobody signing on in those particular groups that get written about a lot. They seem very happy with the dating scene, with people, in relationships and all the rest of it. So I want to ask you two questions. Do you see your story as part of that story, what I'll call the kind of unsettling of relationships and traditional ideas of marriage and family? And what I would ask people who go the other direction and basically don't go through your journey, or I would ask you this 10 years from now, well, how's it all working out for you? Because it seems to me there's a bigger story here, which is the kind of unmooring of things that generations all the way from hunter-gatherers to the present have taken for granted. And I'm not talking about a misogynistic view of women. I'm just talking about a kind of a balanced, ordinary life, if I can put it that way, that works. So one of the things that comes through in your book is a kind of an unmooring from that life. You convert to a form of Christianity which sort of betrays you. You become you don't just get into this, you become a pastor's wife. So you get into the epicenter of the tornado, as it were, to the hottest, worst position you could be in. I'm just wondering how you view that now, aside from the context of your story, which is evangelical Christianity and fundamentalism. We've talked to a lot of people about things like that, like, for instance, A Well-Trained Wife by Tia Levings, other books, similar books. There's a lot of this out there now, most of it written by women. But what I haven't seen anybody do or try to do yet is to contextualize these stories of leaving these evangelical subcultures and escaping from them. And I'm not trying to bait you into saying something here. I'm just genuinely, this is a real question. But isn't there an aspect of all these books, even Tia's and everybody else's, of a sort of bit out of the frying pan into the fire? Because the general culture is totally fucked when it comes to relationships. They are clueless. It's not like out there somewhere there's women who are putting it all together properly. You have individuals whose lives are working quite well, but there's not like, oh, well, this group has their shit together. What can I learn from them? So as you look around as an individual counseling people and a woman who's been through these traumas, the grass is greener on the other side of the fence, but is it? Is there any greener grass anywhere else now? How do you see women's lives these days in the wider context of not just your own experience, but what's going on? Because a lot of people like Magdalene are writing about this and they're saying, no, we're fucked too. Mm-hmm. We're completely fucked. We don't know we're clueless. We have no idea. It's all virtue signaling and, we're so happy. And basically our whole life is online. It's in this phone. It doesn't even exist independently of that. Another article I read recently, someone saying the only real pleasure in dating is comparing notes with the other women about how the date went, because the date's not going to lead anywhere. Yeah. And, 2-3 years with someone, break up, go on, move on. I mean, so the flip side of all this is, well, how's this working out for everybody? So we throw away the ground rules. We say, okay, the men aren't in charge. Good. They shouldn't be. But then, and it's not then who is, but it's like, okay, so when do we get to point to something that works? What works? When you counsel people, what works?
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of what you're saying, just to give it one word, is it's been prescriptive. Like we've lived this prescriptive life and
Mm.
it makes it easy. Like, tell me what to do. I mean, that's what I was looking for. Tell me what to do. How do
Right.
I show up? What do I say? What do I wear? What do I eat? What, you know, and I think the confidence that we need to come that we can have those answers ourselves. So like this weekend, I just led a women's group through some workshops like that of like, how do you come back to that part of you that can make decisions based on who you are and you know the uniqueness that you carry into the world. It takes a lot of pausing. It takes a lot of putting that phone down and not
Yeah.
comparing, and being okay with who you are. And so, I mean, it's a good bit of work. And I don't think there is a group out there that has figured it out. But I think we can. I mean, that's the work I like doing is seeing the light bulbs come on for these individuals, whether they're male or female, and really saying, oh wow, I really enjoy whatever. I like wearing these clothes, or I like these clothes fit me, right? And I would say clothes is a metaphor for behaviors, for
Yeah.
hobbies, for work.
Yeah,
And
I think one of the things you have a quote in here that sort of ties into what I'm asking. Belonging to this religious group promised to save me. It promised if I abided by the rules, I would be safe and I could get the life I dreamed of. I would later find out, even with all my effort and zeal to follow the rules, promises were not kept, nor could and could not be kept. And I would just say, what I'm trying to say is looking at this, that same thing could be written about a lot of the younger career women I know in our bigger cities who are living online and comparing notes. And the group they join is the 4 or 5 friends they go out and have drinks with, and they're always trying to have this great time
yeah,
and be free and all the rest of it. But in terms of their own freedom to think their own thoughts, they're no more free than you were
right.
in an evangelical church as a pastor's wife. They are conforming. I mean, I'm 72 years old, okay, and so my energy is pouring into grandchildren and children. But I can honestly say this: when I look at younger people today,
Hmm.
I've never seen such conformity.
Hmm.
I mean, in my life experience, I come out of the 60s. My first paying job was working on the light show for the Led Zeppelin at the Montreux Jazz Festival, which was, my little rebellion for my fundamentalist community. Nobody down there knew who I was or where I came from. But, the whole thing in the 60s was we're free, it's the counterculture. The older generation doesn't understand. We're going to grow our hair long, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. None of that actually worked out to be what it was claimed to be.
Hmm.
And I'm looking back now and just saying, the basic fabric of human continuity in terms of relationships and the rest of this just keeps getting torn up. And it's not that I'm looking to a kind of a biblical mandate, but, when you read prehistory and you see that hunter-gatherers cared for each other, that they shared childcare and all this other stuff, it's not that if the human race hadn't gotten the continuity of family correct at some point, none of us would be here.
Hmm.
Okay. But it seems to me that I'm doing a whole bunch of books with authors who are writing about how some aspect of this continuity has not worked out for them. But, I keep thinking to myself, okay, so then what can work out other than just another recycling of the 60s idea of I'll do this my way, individuality, blah, blah, blah. What is the thing what is the continuity there in terms of human relationships? Because I think your book can be read a lot of ways, but one of them is it's the anatomy of a particular relationship that didn't go well.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, in a
I don't know if
relationship
that
with
makes any sense
individuals.
to you.
Yeah, and a broader community. I think what I hear you saying in that space is this complexity. And it really is taking these pauses of going, where am I headed with this?
Yeah.
Um, because we do need the greater community for survival. We do, as you alluded to in the hunter gatherers, they needed each other for childcare and food gathering and all the things. And so we need that. But what is the point of becoming an individual? We're not just these autonomous beings and I can do life on my own because we really can't. It's survival won't happen on our own. So how do I be part of the greater community, but still be an individual, and use my gifts and talents in a way that
Mm.
benefits all? And
Yeah, because you're right. You say I was caught up in a system in a marriage and marriage using me without offering me much in return.
yeah. And
I was a direct extension of my husband, as were my children and whatever we did. By the way, how long did the marriage last? I was curious. I'm not very good at math and I didn't add up the years.
it was 25 years,
Yeah, see, it's a long time.
long time.
So it isn't that you sort of tried it for a day and then quit. You hung in there for a long, 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 long time, probably longer than other people would have. Um, I guess to your credit, in the sense that you were invested in it. Others freely judged us and reprimanded my children. It's interesting to me I think there's really two stories in your book, and I want to drill down a little bit on that. One is the personal story of your dysfunctional husband who should have sought help and been forced to get help at some point. But the other is just kind of the dysfunctional community you live in that's all about family values, except it's essentially unfriendly to families.
Mhm.
Other people stepping in to discipline children and all the rest of this. So I want you to just talk about those two different stories and how they parallel and affected you.
Yeah, my husband definitely needed help, and I feel like there were plenty of opportunities. We were also part of Campus Crusade for
Yeah,
9 years, and there's lots of godly people there that could have helped and come alongside. So we weren't this simple being walking around without anybody having
sure.
input into our lives. There would have been, easy conversations that could have happened to say, hey, I'm really struggling with this, or I have depression, I need some help. And like we talked about at the beginning, that is really not something that the church seeks out. Something must be
Mm,
wrong with you. You're not praying hard enough. You're not doing something. And so he definitely needed help. There's been times where other people have said, well, you're a therapist. Couldn't you have fixed him?
yeah,
And no, I couldn't. I
yeah,
think that was part of the problem is I think I was trying to fix a lot, and that was his work that he needed to do alone.
mm,
There were times when the church dictated that we go to marriage counseling, and it would be with the marriage counselor that they had picked and that they were going to get a report from, which violates HIPAA.
great. Yeah,
I never
yeah,
signed anything. But you can't go to marriage counseling if one of the partners has no sense of self and no
yeah,
sense of who they are, because they're bringing a non-person to what needs to be a group process. Um, I think that the other part, I was supposed to give up everything as were my children. And so our house was open all the time for people to come to meals. And my kids were in, prep schools. And so they had tons of homework, but I was
yeah,
supposed to push them off and still entertain the guests that were there, because it was for the glory of God.
yeah,
Rescuing souls was way more important than nurturing my children.
yeah. Well, I got a good dose of that because, of course, the ministry I grew up in was an open home ministry. So basically, privacy didn't exist anywhere because we were essentially all witnesses, and how we behaved would determine the eternal destination of these souls we were taking care of. So you had to be, it was all performative.
Yes. Yeah. And
Yeah.
how terrifying for a child. Like my behavior is, somebody's soul is resting on my behavior.
Yeah, yeah, exactly right. And you say I was caught up in a system of marriage using me without offering much in return, as I read before. But you had this phrase that was good. I was a direct extension of my husband, as were my children, and whatever we did, others freely judged us and reprimanded the children. And then go on. We obligatorily sat in the second row of pews during the service in order to, quote, support the pastor. Subconsciously, the message I received was to look shiny and perfect so the congregation would love the pastor even more because of his perfect family. Just talk for a minute about your husband in the sense that, this was someone you married, and then a couple of weeks in, you realize you didn't know him. So how does that go on for 20 years and you produce children, and then in the end, um, you walk away because he's abusive, but in addition to which, it isn't just about the abuse, it's also about this kind of falsehood which characterizes the whole life. So even if he hadn't been abusive, given the context of your relationship, it would have made sense, I think, for you to walk away at some point because it's an impossible kind of a situation.
Mhm.
When I think of my mother, she created this open home ministry in a way. This was all her great idea. So in our home, she was not being dominated by a man who made her do this stuff, and it was actually the reverse. And he was abusive towards her in the sense of snapping and punching her sometimes. But the fact of the matter was, in terms of who engineered the sort of spiritual vision of the work,
Mhm.
this was my mother's doing. It was
Mhm.
not some man making a woman do this. This was all her idea.
Mhm.
He just wanted to sit upstairs and study his Bible and prepare for the next sermon. And her idea was, no, we have an open home, and it proves the existence of God because we have all these people coming in, and we pray for donations instead of asking for money. This was all something. She was the one from the missionary background that cooked this up. So it was kind of an interesting anomaly because in our household, she was kind of abused and subservient, but on the other hand, very much in charge of this, oh, well, she's the spiritual leader of this. So I think, in fairness to, people whose story comes, there are a lot of women out there who play exactly the same role your husband did. And
Mhm.
I'm always amazed in Christian works how dominant certain types of women are in terms of bossing other women around and making them conform. My wife always said this in terms of, why we don't go to church anymore. She says, I'm just sick of being watched by and told what to do by other women who, think they know everything. So it isn't just a male female dynamic. So talk
Mhm.
about that a little bit, because I know you've observed these things pretty closely.
Yeah, and I would need to say I was in that space as well. A lot of those things you're talking about your mother, if I'm looking at that, yeah, I'm organizing, I'm orchestrating, I'm moving pieces, and a lot of it is about hustling, right?
Yeah.
Got to figure out how to provide for my family,
Yeah.
and I'm recognizing my husband might be pretty inept at a lot of things. There was a point when we moved to Boston, and we were eating up our savings in oil for heating our house.
Sure.
And I was like, we're not making enough money to do this. We're going to need to either move somewhere else, like
Mm.
another church plant somewhere else, or you're going to need to ask the session for more money, which, why can't he recognize that?
Sure. Why can't we heat our house?
Yeah. And so those, so I'm guilty along with your mom in those spaces of orchestrating some of these things. But again, I think was if I can segue a second, I think what was really interesting reading your memoir in that space was like recognizing the thought processes that you were just writing about your mom,
Yeah.
and feeling those same things in myself. And so I felt like there's like these three boxes that sit in front of you, and they're called simplicity, and different
Yeah.
words for simplicity, and all this outside information is coming in and going through these boxes, and
Yeah.
and it's coming to some conclusion, and it's the weirdest conclusion. It doesn't make sense to anybody except you,
Yeah.
and so you're just like, okay, yeah, of course this is what we'll do.
So the next step always seems logical once you get deeper into it. I often think my mother was probably very sincere in the way she saw things, but it was incremental. And basically, from the outside, it looks sort of crazy, but from inside, it all made sense. Like, of course, we have to do all this stuff because otherwise, how do we follow the Lord's leading?
Yeah.
I think a lot of people who haven't been in these environments assume a level of insincerity, and they get it wrong because actually some of the key figures within the middle of these movements really believe what they're saying. At least they did at one point, and then it incrementally becomes about,
Yeah.
paying the oil bill.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, so I think what you're saying is I it's kind of on par with your mom in a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But Beth Allison Barr just wrote a book, Becoming the Pastor's Wife, which is lovely.
Yeah.
And it's
Well,
mostly
she
about
wrote a book, wasn't it? Biblical Womanhood or
yeah, the
something?
making of biblical
Yeah,
woman.
yeah. We interviewed her about that too.
Yeah,
I mean, we will probably do a new one. But
yeah,
anyway,
and
what's the new one about?
um, it's about how the way to ordination for women was becoming a pastor's wife,
Yeah.
because it wasn't allowed. And hers is mostly about the Southern Baptist Church, and I was in the PCA, so but same kind of conservatism,
Mhm.
and I had come from a campus ministry where I got a paycheck and
Yeah.
I had a schedule, and all of a sudden I'm showing up, non-paid labor, full-time job,
Yeah.
trying to get my kids in line. Everybody's serving to make this thing happen for the good of humanity.
Yeah. And it just seems to me, and I've said it probably very clumsily 10 minutes ago, but that when I think of Beth Allison Barr or you or, Tia Lovings and all sorts of other voices that are coming up, women writing about these things, the only thing I keep coming back to, and I'm not sure how to do this, maybe we should do a panel 3 hour interview thing with a bunch of women authors is that my only criticism of all of these books, and I don't mean to criticize the book or the author,
Mhm.
uh, it's just that sometimes the general context of the post 1960s, 1970s, should we say, ripple effect of the feminist movement as it goes out through the entire strata of culture. An example being that evangelical work suddenly in the 60s, like Campus Crusade, started including women and saying, well, yeah, we probably should do something with the women. Let's find something for the women to do. I think when you're part of an experiment, you're one of the white rats in the cage. There are these dim forms moving above you. Once in a while, you're given a shot, and then they take a snip of your ear to test it. It's hard to then get the big picture and get out of the cage and look around and say, wait a minute, we're in a lab, we're being experimented on.
Mhm.
And I think when it comes to relationships and women's roles, quote unquote, whatever that is, um, a lot of my favorite women authors that I interview, I keep thinking to myself, the difference is that, women have brought upon themselves as well as been the recipient of a kind of a cultural change that they're in the middle of and is really hard to see clearly, as in like, hey, it's not all just personal. This is a tsunami and
Mhm.
everybody's being swept along by it. And occasionally Tia Levings or you pop your head up and say, well, here's what happened to me. But that's like discussing the surfboard, but not the wave you're on.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so maybe the next book you write or somebody writes is seriously to delve into this and just say, okay, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. It's not just all personal stories. It's also, there's this huge cultural shift. It'll probably take 100 years to see it clearly, but what the hell? And of course, at the other end, who's Andrew Tate? Who are all these manosphere assholes who are brutal and they're not Christian men telling women to submit to them because God said so. They're just saying, submit to me because I'm a man. I mean, they're way down the path. There's nothing to appeal to
Yeah.
except brute strength.
Yeah.
So I know we're going a bit long here, but I want you to talk about that because I'm not asking you rhetorical questions here. I'm really throwing out what I've been thinking about and churning with and not knowing the answer to. How do you see any of that stuff? I mean,
Yeah.
we're just having a drink now and, forget the podcast part. Let's just talk about that for a minute.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because those same brainwaves have flowed over here for me as the more that I've stepped out of my book. Right. I'm not in the book anymore. I'm not in the trauma that's
Yeah.
happening and being able to find my own confidence in going out and talking and hearing from other people in the world and not being afraid that somebody's not going to believe me. I don't care anymore,
Yeah.
frankly. But and noticing that, like, okay, now that I'm out of this, what is next? What am I noticing in the world? How do we move in this space, which
Mm.
is still so patriarchal, and our political culture is so chaotic, and it feels like it's taking us back 400 years.
Yeah. On
Is
purpose with some of the Trump administration. I mean, they're looking at you. I'm not making this personal now. Don't get even more paranoid. They're looking at Michelle and saying, get her. She's going to a jail.
yeah.
Okay, but anyway, no. But in all seriousness, I mean, we've jumped the thing here. We're into a whole new thing with the Trump administration, where these misogynist, spectrum nerdy types that run all these huge tech companies, and the Trump people are sort of ganging up on women amongst other victims.
Mhm.
So that none of this is just theoretical now. Trying to navigate these waters for the next 10 years and beyond is going to be tough.
Yeah, it is. There's a sense of, okay, we really need to band together, and I'm kind of like, I'm so tired already.
Me too.
Yeah, I'm tired. I just got out of this thing. But really knowing this is our future and
Yeah.
having to speak out, which is also hard and terrifying. But if we start, then we can keep going. It's the 2% rule, right? I'm gonna
Yeah.
see something, maybe, mentioning what college I went to.
Sure.
A good is a place to start. But I'm right on par with you in that it's this place of, what do we do next? We're
Mm.
not just telling small stories. There has been some really good books written around women and how to lead, but also how to play the game.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I love that. I love that you're learning how to be in that space, but also like, why do we have to play the game?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Why is there a game to play? And can we get beyond the game?
Hmm.
And the game even exists within women. And, so I hear what you're saying, and I think it's a huge job that needs to be done moving forward. I think what's coming to my brain right now is just thinking about the signs on the genogram, or they're even on bathroom doors, of the
Yeah.
circle and the triangle. The triangle's on the men doors, and it's just a picture of hierarchy.
Yeah.
The matriarchy is really a picture of inclusion. It's a circle, right? And how do we get to that place? Because that's for everybody, you know?
Yeah. And I think the essential question, and I brought up one of my other guests that I talked about here earlier in this piece she just wrote that came out today. When I think of what she writes, Magdalene Taylor, and the kind of analysis of relationships that you're making too, at a certain point, if it's not going to be Andrew Tate and the Manosphere and incels and all these other guys all the way down, at some point, somebody like, Tia Levings, like you, Melanie Brooks, whomever, has to say, okay, here's what a good relationship would look like.
Mhm.
It can't just all be, here's why mine didn't work and I was abused. It
Mhm.
has to at some point be, yeah, but this is what, if you're sitting as a counselor with a younger couple who are in love and want to do the right thing, where there's a young man who says, look, I don't want to be one of these guys, and a young woman who says, look, I'm not just the product of some, bitter women's study program where I already hate men. We both want to actually make this work.
Mhm.
At some point, I'm just saying, well, what do you tell them? What's a good relationship look like in this tidal wave of change? And
Mhm.
that's what I think we don't have much of.
Mhm. I'll do it.
Yeah, you should.
No, and I think it's so interesting though, because we have these backstories that come with us, right? And we see how roles are played out in our
Mhm.
families, and we just automatically assume that that's right. And so if we can't be questioners, if we won't allow our bodies to feel dissonance when we change our minds.
Yeah,
I'm partnered very happily now. And at the beginning of my relationship, I write about this in my book. I asked him, can you rescue me? Because that was what came to my mind. I
sure.
needed to be rescued by a savior, and I needed to be rescued by my husband because I was worthless as a single woman. And
Yeah,
he very kindly says, I'm not doing that. You
yeah,
got this. You got this.
yeah,
And I think it would be easy to read my book and go, okay, now she lives this nice, comfortable life and she's breathing. And I think coming out of something like that, or
mm,
Tia, or somebody else, it's like we cannot quiet our voices anymore.
yeah,
I can't live a quiet life. It would be a disservice to myself.
yeah, of course. And a disservice to people who should be reading your next book when you tell us how to do the right thing.
Yeah, I think the social relationships are, that's a doozy. And I think a lot of people walk into spaces of, I'm going to get married, or I'm going to find the perfect boyfriend, be the perfect
Mhm.
girlfriend, and don't realize that we're dynamic beings and we're constantly changing. I
Yeah, but
just,
on the other hand, there is another side to this, and that is with this sort of grass is greener idea. I think people that come out of an evangelical background or a strict Roman Catholic background, of course, you're different because you came from one background, went into another one, and now you're out again. But um, there's this assumption that somebody with a more secular view, more grounded in psychology, more grounded in science, has basically got the formula down. But when you look at the numbers, that may not be so. And that's why I keep going back to this idea that there has to be a sort of a groundwork that has to be relayed again, assuming people want to have relationships that work.
Mhm.
And it can't be all this online performative bullshit that so many young women are into, and young guys not so much because they're all looking at Andrew Tate videos and trying to buy a Bugatti somewhere. I mean, it's really a bad situation. And like I say, as a 70-year-old kind of looking at it and sending off these grandchildren into that maelstrom, um, the chances of winding up in a good relationship that works out are slimmer. And then on the other hand, all the studies point to the fact that loneliness is a far bigger killer than anybody thought. So it's like really burning the candle at both ends.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
if the high point of a date for the young woman in New York about town doing her cool thing is to tell her friends about why it didn't work out. At a certain point, she's going to be alone in her life because that's not the track that leads toward anything workable for people for more than a few years when you feel you're young and you're doing all this hot stuff.
Mhm.
On the other hand, all these guys being raised in a patriarchal homeschool household are a nightmare. I mean, they're going to make terrible husbands and fathers and just try to dominate another group of women. So, like I say, this is not rhetorical, but I am fishing around to get some thoughts from you, and then we'll wrap this up. Where do we begin to put this puzzle back together again?
Mhm. Mhm. I think that the challenge is really, how do we create independent thinkers?
Mm-hmm.
How do we teach people to question what they're being heard and search for good answers? I think we've done a disservice to high school students when we took away home economics
Yep, I agree. And civics.
and civics. And how do I balance a checkbook? I mean, I don't think anybody had checkbooks anymore, but
Yeah.
how do we make a budget? I think basic living is just destroyed. I'm a big believer in mental, emotional, social intelligence.
Yeah.
It has to be taught. It is not something that we are innately aware of.
Mm.
So
Okay, so go find a title and write your book. Put a pitch together.
there we go.
Melanie's very good at taking a book, reading it, and writing you a good one-page pitch. She just did it for me last week and sending it off to my agent saying, okay, here's the book. Because I'm very bad at pitching my own stuff.
Yeah, I didn't have to do that because I self-published or hybrid published.
Yeah. Well, I've done one like that out of my many books, but I think the next thing I want to work on is basically, of course, no one is reading anyway, so who gives a shit? It's like,
Well, we
you know,
are. Come on.
you're not. I'm sort of reading. I read book. Hey, if I wasn't doing this podcast, I wouldn't be reading 2, 3 books a week. I used to.
Yeah. What are you doing instead?
I'm reading 2 or 3 books a week because I'm doing this stupid podcast.
Oh, true.
And Ernie texts me and says, "Are you prepared?" My producer. And then I, drag myself out of bed and put the book on Kindle and start reading it early in the morning. And then because if I read it a week before,
Yeah.
and this is part of getting older too, your brain doesn't work. Well, it never did work that way. But, if I'm doing 2, 3 books a week and interviewing authors, I have to read the book I'm going to interview within the 24-hour period I do the interview.
Yeah.
And I put on my notes, which I've been looking at as I talk to you. Because otherwise it's like, who am I talking to today? It's Tuesday. It must be Michelle.
Yeah. So what would you do if you weren't reading 2 to 3 books?
No, I do what I'd write my next book and I take care of my grandchildren.
Yeah. Those are pretty amazing
And
things.
basically, I'd rather be in the Piazza Navona in Rome at any given moment because
And
that's.
and I think, you're also the voice, right? It's
But the irony is, I've written all these books and some of them have done quite well. But if I put something on YouTube, it has to be set a commentary and it takes off as some do quite often, then more people are watching that on YouTube within a 3-week period than have read all my books put together. On the other hand, it doesn't translate to anything you can measure. They don't all send me $1. Some subscribe to Substack, and that keeps the machine going. But the whole thing's changed. Back in the day, if I was on a TV show or on NPR and interviewed by, on Fresh Air or something, you'd see a bounce. Your agent would call you and say, "Hey, that really helped the book. We're hearing from the publisher." Now you can have something online or, on YouTube or whatever, and literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people can watch it. And it doesn't translate at all into the written word.
mm-hmm.
So if you're going to be on whatever it is out there and make money from it, then you've got to be promoting non-book items. In other words, if you're an influencer and you're selling whatever the hell you're selling, then that's how people earn a living from communicating, but it's not communicating, it's just marketing.
No, I would agree. I think a lot of people listen to a podcast and go, "Okay, got the sum of the book.
Yeah.
I'm good."
Yeah, exactly. Hopefully a few people are going to read your book, and we'll leave it there by just saying that you have written a good book, and I would hope people would read it. So go out and do that likewise. Hold the book up one more time. Okay, so this is Cracked Open, and that's the book we've been talking about. And please stay on after I get off here. I'm going to leave, but stick around and talk to Ernie so we make sure we post everything that will help your book wherever we do this. And you can give him ideas like Melanie gave us your name for whomever you think we should be talking to. And then go write a book on what a good relationship is.
Okay, I got it.
All right. Talk to you soon. Thank you. Thanks so much for being
Thanks for having me.
lovely. Okay, bye.